I was folding linens in the guest room when I saw the envelope. Cream-colored, heavy, formal. My name, written in handwriting I hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades. No return address, no warmth. Just a message inside that read, "You're invited to Thanksgiving." It would mean a lot to the kids. Signed with her name. Not Love Rachel. Not even Mom. Just Rachel. My daughter. 28 years of silence. No phone calls. No letters. Not even word through the grapevine. She had cut me out cleanly, like trimming fat from meat. And now, with the ink barely dry on my inheritance, she remembered me. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't tear it up either. I simply placed it beside my tea and stared at it, the past pressing against my chest like it had just knocked at the door. I didn't need her money. I could almost hear her thinking. But now that I had my own, I was useful again. If you've ever been forgotten until you were needed, if you've ever wondered what would happen if you stopped apologizing and started remembering who you were, stay with me. Because this Thanksgiving, I brought more than pie. I brought the truth. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? Tell me in the comments. Before we continue, please subscribe. I had just finished smoothing the last sheet over the guest bed when I saw it. Tucked between the utility bill and a holiday catalog, as if it were any other piece of mail. I nearly missed it. My name was written in a careful hand that once labeled lunchboxes and signed permission slips. There was a hesitation in the strokes, like the writer wasn't sure if I'd still recognize her. But I did. I would have known it anywhere. Rachel. My daughter. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that has nothing to do with paper. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down with it in front of me, untouched. There was no need to rush. After 28 years, I could let it sit a few minutes longer. When I finally opened it, the message inside was brief, polite, distant. You're invited to Thanksgiving. It would mean a lot to the kids. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the years in between, the birthdays missed, the milestones unshared, the decades where my voice was unwelcome in her world. Just an invitation, a request dressed up as generosity. I read the note twice, then a third time. My hands didn't shake. There was no dramatic gasp, no tears falling onto the ink. Instead, I felt a kind of stillness I hadn't known in years. It was the stillness of a wound that had already scarred, of knowing that something had already broken long ago, and all that remained was the space where it used to live. I didn't have to ask why she was reaching out now. It wasn't the sudden pull of maternal instinct or a reawakening of love. It was the fortune, the inheritance, the thing I had never chased but somehow ended up with. When Daniel, my late brother, her uncle, her godfather, passed away last spring and left me his estate, the press mentioned it. It was small news, regional at best, but enough to circulate. Enough for someone to forward her the article. Enough to remind her that the mother she had once left behind was no longer just a name on a family tree, but someone with weight, with assets. She hadn't spoken my name in almost 30 years, but now she wanted it written on a place card at the holiday table. I placed the letter on the table and went back to the guest room, smoothing the same sheet I'd already finished. It gave my hands something to do. She had asked me to come home for Thanksgiving, but I no longer knew where home was. All I knew was, I wasn't walking into that house as the woman who had begged to be forgiven. That version of me had been left behind, somewhere around year 15. This year, I was coming as someone else. Not the mother who had been erased, but the woman who had never disappeared. Time has a way of folding in on itself when you live with silence. The years don't stretch. They tighten, compress, until whole seasons pass without marking themselves, and suddenly a decade has gone by without your noticing. That's what it was like without Rachel. Not loud grief, not chaos, just stillness. A long, uninterrupted quiet where a daughter used to be. The last time I saw her, she slammed the door so hard a frame fell off the hallway wall. It was a photo of the two of us in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, mine cupped around hers, guiding. She was 17. Furious. Unforgiving. The kind of anger that doesn't leave room for nuance. She had said things that day that didn't leave room for anything at all. And I had let her. I didn't chase her down the driveway. I didn't call her back inside. I simply stood there, my palms pressed against the wallpaper, and listened to her tires crunch down the gravel road like punctuation marks on the end of everything. She told people I abandoned her, that I chose someone else over her, that when I married again, I stopped being her mother. What she didn't say, what no one ever asked me, is what came before all that. The years I raised her alone, the nights I sat in the dark, bills in one hand, bottle in the other. The day I found her father's note, and the hole it carved through both of us. I made mistakes. I didn't always know how to love without leaving bruises. But I stayed. Even when it hurt. Even when she wouldn't look me in the eye. She left at 17 and never came back. Not for holidays. Not when her grandfather died. Not even when I was in the hospital after the car accident that took most of the strength from my left side. The nurses asked if I had family they should call. I told them no. I didn't have the energy to explain that I had a daughter who used to braid my hair while I graded papers, who once called me her best friend, who hadn't spoken to me since before she was old enough to vote. I used to imagine what I'd say if she ever returned. I pictured dramatic reunions, tears, apologies. But after 28 years, the fantasy softened, dulled into something quiet. A single word spoken with meaning would have been enough. Mom. Even whispered. Even hesitant. But when the letter came, there was none of that. No bridge, no reckoning. Just an invitation to step back into a room I was once shut out of, as if the years in between had been a technical glitch, a misunderstanding. 28 years of silence doesn't end with a dinner invitation, but it does tell you everything about why it started, and what you're really walking into. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone who's still alive. It's not sudden. There's no funeral, no casseroles dropped off at your door. Just a slow, daily ache that grows quieter over time until even your sorrow begins to feel like a memory. That's what losing Rachel was like. I didn't mourn her all at once. I mourned her in pieces. First, it was the silence on her birthday, then the absence at Christmas, then the moment I realized I no longer knew where she lived, or whether she still liked the color green, or how her laugh had changed over time. I would reach for the phone sometimes, on instinct, in moments of weakness, only to remember there was nothing on the other end of the line. Not even anger anymore. Just nothing. When people asked about her, I learned to smile gently and say, "She's doing well, I think." I'd change the subject quickly, before the follow-up questions came. It became easier to let them believe the distance was mutual, as if we were simply two people who drifted, instead of what it really was, her choosing to forget me, and me learning to live with it. After a while, even the pain dulled. I stopped imagining reconciliation, stopped replaying old conversations in my head, wondering where I went wrong. The truth was, there was no single moment. It wasn't one fight, one betrayal. It was a lifetime of tension, misunderstandings layered so thick neither of us could breathe beneath them. I tried to write her letters. I still have the drafts in a box upstairs, yellowed and unopened. They never felt right. Too desperate. Too hopeful. And I'd already learned what happened when I reached too hard for her. I bled. So I let the years pass. I filled them with other things: books, work, solitude. I rebuilt my life in the empty spaces she left behind. I planted roses in the backyard, took night classes at the community center. I learned how to enjoy quiet mornings and solo holidays, even if the quiet sometimes threatened to crush me. But no matter how much I filled, there was always one chair left empty in my heart. And I stopped trying to seat anyone else there. That was the part no one understood. I never stopped being her mother. Even in the silence, even in the pain, I carried her in every part of my life. She didn't know it, but I celebrated her birthdays with a cupcake and a candle. I watched the Thanksgiving parade each year and wondered where she was. I pictured her eating with someone else's family, laughing at jokes I'd never hear. So when that letter arrived, it didn't open a door. It pressed on an old bruise, a daughter I had lost, a mother left behind. And now, both being asked to pretend the wound had never existed. It wasn't raining the day she left. I used to imagine it that way, for the sake of dramatics. A sky splitting open, thunder rolling, a cinematic backdrop for a daughter turning her back on her mother. But it was clear, cloudless. An ordinary day in late summer, heavy with heat and things unsaid. The windows were open. The air smelled like tomato vines and resentment. She had packed her things the night before, quietly, carefully, like someone evacuating a place she had already grieved. I didn't try to stop her. I told myself it was just another one of her declarations, the kind of storm she liked to summon before settling again. But something about the way she folded her clothes told me this wasn't a tantrum. This was final. She had just turned 17. She was tall by then, almost taller than me, with a sharpness in her eyes I didn't know how to soften anymore. Everything I said irritated her. Everything I did was wrong. I used to tell myself it was just the age, just the weight of grief she didn't know how to carry. Her father had left us both when she was still small, a man who liked the sound of promises, but not the burden of keeping them. She used to ask where he went. Later, she stopped asking altogether, and I was left holding both their absences. When she stood at the door that day, duffel bag on her shoulder, she said something I will never forget. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. "You never really saw me," she said. "You just saw the daughter you wanted me to be." I wanted to argue, to explain, but I didn't. Maybe she was right. I had spent so long trying to protect her from pain that I stopped listening to her when she spoke it. I mistook silence for peace. I mistook distance for growth. She stepped outside, the screen door creaking behind her. I stood in the hallway, rooted to the floor, heart pounding in that way it does when you know something is ending, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. I heard the car start. I heard it leave. And just like that, the house changed shape. I kept her room exactly as it was for years. Her books, her posters, the sweatshirt she left draped over the back of her chair. I vacuumed around it, dusted her shelves, told myself she'd come back when she cooled off. But the seasons turned, and she didn't. I tried, in the beginning. A letter, a call, a message left with a cousin. But her silence was sharp, intentional. It wasn't a cry for attention. It was a declaration of independence. And after enough unanswered attempts, I stopped reaching. Not because I didn't love her, but because I did. And love, I had learned, sometimes means letting someone walk away, even when they're walking away from you. When your child leaves you, not in death, but by choice, you don't just lose them. You lose the version of yourself that only existed because they did. The caretaker, the protector, the one who knew their lunch order, the sound of their footsteps, the look in their eyes when they were on the verge of laughter. When Rachel walked away, I didn't just lose a daughter. I lost the woman I had become around her. At first, I waited. That's what mothers do, I suppose. We wait. For the phone to ring. For the apology we pretend we don't need. For the footsteps on the porch that tell us they've remembered. I waited through holidays and birthdays, through quiet mornings with 2 coffee cups instead of 1. I waited through guilt, then grief, then something else entirely. Something like acceptance, but more hollow. I stopped keeping her room ready after the 5th year. Not out of anger, but because it felt dishonest. Like I was preserving a museum to someone who didn't plan to return. I sold the house eventually. Too many ghosts in the walls. I moved to a smaller place, a simpler one. No stairs, no guest rooms, no need to explain why Thanksgiving was always just me. I started walking in the mornings. I learned to cook for one. I joined a local book club and stopped lying when people asked if I had children. I do, I'd say, and then change the subject. No one ever pressed. Without Rachel, I had space I didn't know what to do with. Time stretched wide. At first, I filled it with distraction, cleaning, organizing, volunteering, but eventually, I learned to sit with it. I got comfortable with my own company. I read the paper slowly. I learned how to repot plants. I stopped flinching when I heard her name on television or in passing conversation. And then one day, I realized I was no longer waiting. Not because I didn't love her, but because I had made peace with the idea that I might never hear her voice again. That motherhood, for me, had ended in mid-sentence. And somehow, I had survived it. It was in that stillness that life started reshaping itself. Quietly, without ceremony. My brother died that same year. We weren't close toward the end, but he left me everything. No one saw it coming. Especially not me. The estate was old money, land, investments, things I'd never imagined holding in my name. People started calling me Mins, Linton again, as if I were someone with gravity. But I didn't feel different. I was still the woman who made tea at 6, who watched the birds from her porch, who had memorized the sound of her own loneliness. And then, not long after the news ran about the estate, the letter from Rachel arrived. A daughter who hadn't spoken to me in 28 years, inviting me home, just in time for Thanksgiving. People say money changes everything. But that's not entirely true. It doesn't change the ache of being forgotten. It doesn't rewrite history or smooth over old conversations that ended too abruptly. It doesn't pull a daughter's voice back into your life or undo nearly 3 decades of absence. What money does, more than anything, is rearrange the way people look at you. Suddenly, you're not just a woman in a quiet house. You're someone worth noticing again. After Daniel's death, the attention came like a tide. Distant cousins who hadn't called in years. Neighbors who had always nodded politely, but never invited me in. People asked how I was holding up, but what they really meant was, "What will you do with it?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't feel like someone who had inherited anything. I still bought day-old bread and folded towels the same way. I still used tea bags twice and rinsed out jars to reuse. Wealth felt like a costume someone had handed me, and I didn't know how to wear it. But Rachel must have read the news. Maybe someone sent her the article, or maybe she had a search set up, just in case. However it happened, the letter followed not long after. A simple invitation, with no sentiment to soften it. "You're invited to Thanksgiving. It would mean a lot to the kids." There it was, that word. Kids. Grandchildren I'd never met. Faces I didn't know. Birthdays I'd missed. And suddenly, it wasn't just my daughter I'd lost. It was an entire branch of a family tree I hadn't been allowed to touch. I held the letter and wondered if it would have come had Daniel not left me the estate. I tried not to ask myself that question, but it returned like a tide, over and over again. Not out of bitterness, but honesty. Because I knew what it was to be invisible, and I knew what it looked like when people decided you were useful again. Still, there was something in me that stirred. Maybe curiosity, maybe hope, maybe the small, trembling piece of me that had never stopped wanting to be let back in. Not just into Rachel's house, but into the story of her life. To see the woman she'd become. To look into the eyes of the children who shared her name and find something familiar. Something that said I hadn't been completely erased. Money didn't fix the past. It didn't quiet the silence. But it opened a door. And after 28 years of standing outside, a part of me still wanted to walk through it. Not for wealth, not for recognition, but for the chance to be seen, before it was too late to matter. The estate wasn't extravagant by modern standards, but it carried a certain kind of weight. The kind built over generations, not just in dollars, but in land and history, and the way people say your name with a different tone once you have something they don't. Daniel had been private, meticulous, and unapologetically old-fashioned. He had no children, no spouse, no one close except me, and even that closeness had grown quiet over the years. Still, he left everything to me. The land upstate, the investment accounts, the antique furniture he insisted on maintaining himself. The house was large but unpretentious, the kind that creaked in the right places and smelled faintly of oak and tobacco. I hadn't visited often in the later years. Life had narrowed, as it tends to do when you live quietly, and our conversations had faded into short calls and occasional letters. But he remembered me, and not just with sentiment. He remembered me with trust. He put my name on every line that mattered. The executor called to confirm details, and I remember the pause in his voice when I answered, as if he'd expected someone else, someone more involved. But Daniel knew. He knew who had stayed by his side when no one else had a reason to. The news ran in a local business column, just a few paragraphs buried between stock updates and real estate sales. But someone found it. Someone always does. And from there, the ripple began. I could feel it in the way people lingered a little longer in conversation. In the tone of an old friend's voicemail, suddenly chipper. In the sudden, peculiar kindness of Rachel's invitation, so carefully timed, it could almost pass for coincidence. It's strange, really. For years I had been the woman left behind, the mother forgotten. No one came looking. No one asked what I had lost. But once I became an heiress, if you could even call me that, I became someone worth remembering. I didn't know whether to laugh or weep at the irony of it all. I didn't reply to Rachel's invitation right away. I kept it on the mantel, read it every morning like it might say something new. But it remained the same. Flat, polite, unemotional. Not a word about the past. Not a whisper of apology. Just coordinates for a meal, as if all we'd ever needed was a table and some turkey to stitch back together what 28 years had unraveled. I wondered if she thought I would arrive, smiling, grateful just to be invited again. If she thought money had softened my spine. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the fortune hadn't changed me. It had simply made me visible. And now that they finally saw me again, I had no intention of shrinking back into the woman they once forgot. There's a particular weight to an invitation when it comes wrapped in history. Not the kind you frame or tuck into scrapbooks, but the kind you feel between your ribs, tight and unspoken. Rachel's card sat on my mantel for nearly a week. I'd read it in the morning with my tea, holding it like something fragile, trying to understand what exactly she was asking for. A seat at the table? A performance? A donation? It didn't feel like a gesture of reconciliation. It felt like a transaction. A soft request stitched between the lines, too careful to be called a favor, but obvious enough that I could feel its shape. It wasn't just about the children. It wasn't just Thanksgiving. It was an audition. A test to see if I would show up, play nice, fold myself neatly into a version of the past we'd never lived, but could pretend to for an afternoon. I kept waiting for a second letter. One that said, "I'm sorry." One that said, "I missed you." But it never came. Just that single sterile invitation asking me to appear, with no acknowledgement of what it cost to disappear me in the first place. I imagined her at her kitchen table, composing it. The handwriting was hers, yes, but something about it felt formal, like it had been drafted 3 or 4 times before making it to the final envelope. She'd called me mother in the salutation, not mom, not the name she once screamed in the middle of the night when she had a fever. Just mother, a title, a placeholder. I suppose that's what I had become to her, a category she could reopen now that I came with assets attached. Still, something in me couldn't throw it away. Not because I believed she wanted me there for the right reasons, but because deep down, I needed to see for myself. I needed to know what had become of her, of us. I needed to look into the eyes of the woman I raised and find out if she had really buried me, or if part of her had just been waiting, like I had, for the silence to crack. So I bought a dress. Simple, soft gray. The kind you wear when you don't want to look like you're trying too hard, but still want to be remembered. I pressed it 3 times before packing it into the garment bag. I rehearsed answers to questions she might not ask. Practiced breathing through the kind of small talk that slices deep when you're pretending everything's fine. The night before I was set to leave, I stood in front of the mirror, invitation in one hand, a trembling glass of water in the other. And I said, out loud, to no one but my reflection, "I'm not going there to be forgiven." I paused, swallowed. "I'm going there to be seen." The drive was long, but not unfamiliar. I'd traced that same stretch of highway when Rachel was still young, when her backpack rattled in the back seat, and she talked to herself through her stuffed animals. I used to know every diner and billboard on the way to where she lived, back when I was still welcome. But this time, the road felt foreign. The landmarks had changed. Or maybe I had. I pulled into the driveway a few minutes past noon, earlier than I intended but too late to turn around. The house was large, not grand, but polished in the way things are when someone wants to be noticed without seeming like they care. There were already 3 other cars parked out front. I sat for a moment, engine ticking, heart pacing itself. Then I turned the key, stepped out, and straightened my coat. She answered the door herself. No hug, no expression. Just a blink of surprise that didn't last long enough to count as emotion. "You came," she said, as if the possibility of me showing up had been theoretical until the very moment I stood on her porch. I nodded. "You invited me." Inside, it smelled like rosemary and roasted meat. The table was already set, linen napkins, polished silverware, name cards written in the same neat handwriting I'd seen on the envelope. Mine said, Margaret, not Mom, not even Mother. Just Margaret, like a distant relative someone was told to include out of obligation. There were children in the living room. 2 boys and a girl, none older than 12. They looked at me the way children do when they know your name, but not your story. Rachel introduced me briefly, like a footnote in a conversation she didn't want to dwell on. "This is Margaret," she told them. "She's my mother." The pause before the word wasn't long, but I felt it catch in my chest. I sat at the table, 2 seats down from her, between the girl and an older man I assumed was her husband. He was kind in the way polite men are, smiled often, said little. He offered me wine. I accepted. I sipped slowly. The meal began with pleasantries, weather, school updates, how tall the kids had gotten. I smiled when I was supposed to, nodded when expected. Rachel spoke like a hostess. I recognized that version of her. Controlled, composed, rehearsed. She passed the stuffing without looking at me. And yet, there I was, seated at the same table she once swore she'd never let me near again. She had made space for me, not with warmth, not with forgiveness, but with presence. And in that small, measured place between her silence and my restraint, something unspoken hovered over the cranberry sauce and sweet potatoes. Not reconciliation. Not yet. But the first course of something we hadn't tasted in years. Proximity. Children have a way of revealing truths adults work hard to hide. They don't mean to, of course. They just speak what they know, or more often, what they've been taught not to ask. I was halfway through my second helping of green beans when the youngest, the girl with Rachel's eyes, looked up at me and asked, "Were you Mommy's teacher?" The table went still, just for a second, but enough for everyone to hear the question settle. Rachel froze, fork poised midair. Her husband cleared his throat and reached for the gravy boat like it could redirect the moment. I smiled gently, steadying my voice. "No, sweetheart. I'm your grandmother." She blinked, as if processing the word. Her little brow furrowed. "But Mommy never said we had a grandmother." I nodded, slowly, keeping my eyes on her and not on Rachel. "Well, you do," I said, "and I'm very glad to meet you." She didn't respond right away, just looked at her plate, then at her mother. Rachel offered a tight smile, the kind that looks like apology, but costs nothing. She didn't correct her daughter. She didn't elaborate. She simply said, "Eat your food, honey," and passed the bread, like the moment hadn't just split the room open. I sat there, chewing slowly, tasting every bit of what wasn't being said. These children, my grandchildren, had no stories of me. No bedtime tales that began with, "When I was your age." No photos of me holding their mother. No names for me in their mouths. Not Nana. Not Grandma. Not anything at all. To them, I was a stranger. And not by accident. It's one thing to lose your daughter. It's another to realize she had erased you so completely that the next generation didn't even know where you belonged. There was no curiosity in their faces, no spark of recognition. Just polite confusion, like meeting a guest at a party you weren't told was coming. I watched them laugh and argue and pass dishes to one another, and I mourned the years I hadn't seen. First steps, first teeth, first recitals. I had missed it all, not because I chose to, but because someone else had decided I didn't deserve the invitation. Rachel kept the conversation moving, asked her husband about the office, complimented the cranberry sauce, never once looked at me directly. But her children did. Glances, then longer looks, like they were trying to fit me into the story they'd never been told. And in that quiet, between the mashed potatoes and the pumpkin pie, I realized something I hadn't prepared for. You can live long enough to see your own child become a gatekeeper. And when they close that door, it's not just you they shut out. It's everything that ever tied you to the family you once believed you were building. After the pie had been sliced and the plates scraped clean, the kids were excused to the living room. Their laughter drifted down the hallway like a language I used to understand, but no longer spoke. The adults remained at the table, sipping coffee, loosening belts, pretending that full bellies could soften the quiet edges of a stiff reunion. Rachel was gathering plates when her husband turned to me with a kind smile and a question that might have been innocent, if such things were ever really innocent. "So, Margaret," he said, swirling cream into his mug, "what's your story?" It was the kind of question people ask when they want to seem interested without prying. But something in his tone wasn't casual. It was curious, a bit too intentional. And then he added, as if that clarified things, "You know, What brought you here today? Alone? The word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. Alone. He meant it kindly, I think. But it stung, because he didn't know how far that word reached. Alone wasn't just how I arrived. It was how I'd spent 28 holidays. It was how I fell asleep on birthdays without candles. It was how I waited beside a phone that never rang. I could feel Rachel tense from across the room, her back to us as she ran water over the dishes. She didn't turn around. She didn't interrupt. She let me answer, or not, like she wasn't interested either way. I sipped my coffee to buy a moment. The mug was warm in my hands, solid in a way I hadn't felt since stepping into the house. I looked at him, this man who shared a bed with my daughter, who fathered the children I hadn't been allowed to know, and I decided to give him a piece of the truth. "I'm here," I said softly, "because someone finally remembered I existed." He blinked, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "I didn't mean—" I raised a hand gently, not to chastise, but to let him off the hook. "It's all right. I'm used to questions without easy answers." Rachel still didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders still slightly. Listening. Always listening, even if she never said a word. He nodded slowly, taking in more than just the words. He was the kind of man who understood subtext, I could tell. And maybe he hadn't known the full story, but now he'd seen the edges of it. The empty seat I filled. The silence wrapped around my presence like a shawl. I set my mug down, the ceramic clinking lightly against the saucer. "Alone isn't always a choice," I added, "but sometimes it becomes a strength." He didn't argue, and Rachel still didn't speak. But I saw it in her back, in the way her hands slowed at the sink. She'd heard me, and for the first time that day, she didn't run. The wine came out sometime after dusk, when the children had retreated fully into their screens and the adults had begun to loosen around the edges. Rachel poured it herself, something red and expensive looking, the kind with a label that didn't need explaining. She didn't ask if I wanted any, just filled the glass in front of me without a word. It was the closest thing to a gesture we'd shared all day. Her husband rose from his seat with a grin that suggested he'd been thinking about this moment for a while. "We should do a toast," he said, lifting his glass. "To family. To being together." He glanced at Rachel as he said it, and I saw her nod faintly, like she was agreeing to a contract she hadn't read too closely. Then all eyes turned to me. I hadn't prepared for this. I hadn't prepared for any of it. But especially not the part where I'd be asked to raise a glass with people who hadn't spoken my name in years. I lifted mine slowly, fingertips brushing the stem, and stood. My knees were stiff, not from age, but from the weight of holding everything inside all day. "To family," I repeated softly, then paused. I looked around the table, the faces I didn't know, the woman I used to cradle in my arms, now stiff-backed and silent. "To the ones we hold close," I added, "and the ones we let slip away." No one moved. "To the stories we don't tell," I continued, my voice steadier now, "and the ones we rewrite in hopes no one remembers the first draft." Rachel's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to wound. I was just tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of acting like I hadn't been invisible for nearly 3 decades. Like I hadn't stood on the other side of a locked door waiting for someone to remember I was there. "And to the chance," I finished, "that sometimes, after enough time has passed, we find our way back. Not because we forgot the past, but because we're finally ready to face it." I raised my glass. Rachel didn't lift hers. Her husband did, slowly. So did her in-laws. There was an awkward clink of crystal, a murmur of agreement, but the words felt heavier than the moment could hold. I sipped once, then sat down, the air noticeably tighter than before. Rachel looked up then, just once. Her eyes found mine, and for a second, I saw the girl who used to laugh with her whole face. But the look vanished just as quickly. She blinked, looked away, and reached for a napkin she didn't need. The toast was over. The room shifted. But something had landed between us. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But a truth that no one could take back. After the toast, no one quite knew what to say. The conversation limped forward in starts and stops, like a car trying to run on an empty tank. Rachel refilled water glasses that were already full. Her husband complimented the pie twice. Her in-laws murmured politely about how lovely everything was. But the air had changed. Not in the way a storm does, loudly and with warning, but like a still room where someone had just told the truth, and now no one knew how to sit in it. I watched Rachel move through the room like a ghost inside her own home. Polite, precise, performing. She had always been good at that. Even as a child, she knew how to present herself in the way she believed others needed her to be. I used to think it was maturity. Now I wondered if it was armor. We made it through dessert without another eruption, though I could feel her watching me from the corners of her eyes. The children returned briefly to say goodnight, one offering a stiff wave, the other too distracted to even glance my way. The little girl, the one who asked if I was a teacher, hugged her mother tightly and whispered something into her ear. Rachel didn't respond, but her face shifted. I couldn't read it. The kitchen grew quieter once they left. Plates scraped, water ran, and a silence unfolded between Rachel and me, deeper than any words we'd exchanged. Her husband made an excuse and disappeared down the hallway, and for the first time all day, it was just the two of us. She stood at the sink, her back to me, the same as earlier. Her hands moved slowly over a serving spoon, scrubbing it even though it was already clean. I waited. I had waited for years. What was a few more minutes? Then, softly, she spoke. "You weren't supposed to come," she said. Not angrily, not accusing, just honestly. "I know," I replied. She turned, finally facing me. Her eyes were red but dry. "I thought if I invited you, you'd decline, or ignore it. She trailed off, and I saw it then. Not resentment, not defiance, but fear. Deep, buried fear that if she opened the door too wide, everything she had built would collapse under the weight of what she left behind. "I wasn't sure I'd come either," I said. She nodded. The corners of her mouth twitched like she wanted to say something else, but the words caught. We stood there for a long moment, two women tied together by something stronger than blood. The ache of too many years lost. That Thanksgiving wasn't filled with laughter or second helpings or traditions rekindled. It didn't look like the kind of reunion people write into holiday movies. But it was honest. And maybe that was the most anyone could ask for after 28 years of silence. We didn't speak again that night. Not really. Rachel offered me the guest room with a tight, practical nod, and I accepted. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan as it traced slow circles above me. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak in the walls, the sound of a dishwasher finishing its cycle, and the faint murmur of voices behind a closed bedroom door. I couldn't tell if they were arguing or simply speaking in tones too hushed for me to catch. Either way, I didn't listen. I'd already heard enough. I hadn't come with an agenda. Despite what she might have thought, I didn't pack the letter from the attorney. I hadn't tucked it into my purse as a trump card or brought papers with promises of inheritance. In truth, I never planned to say a word about the will. Not that night. Not then. I hadn't come to wave the money in her face or hold it out like a prize she'd only earn if she behaved. But now, lying in her guest bed, still wearing the dress I hadn't bothered to change out of, I couldn't help thinking of Daniel. How he'd asked me, months before his health failed completely, "Do you think she'll show up if it's you who has something to give?" I remember shaking my head. "She won't come for me," I'd said. "She doesn't even know who I am anymore." He'd been quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, he said something I haven't forgotten. "Then make sure she remembers, even if it's the last thing you give her." He knew. He always did. The will was clear. Everything he left to me would, in time, pass to whom I chose. There were no children of his own, no other names. And while the lawyers had pressed for designations and contingencies, I kept it simple. I'd decided quietly to leave it to her children, not out of obligation, but because I wanted them to have what I never could give Rachel: stability, a foundation, a future without silence between the bricks. But I never told her, because I needed her to look at me, not what I had, not what I could do for her, but me. That night, I fell asleep just before the sky began to shift toward morning. I dreamt of a house with every door open, windows wide, wind moving freely from room to room. Rachel stood in the kitchen in that dream, barefoot, humming. When I woke, the hum was gone, but the ache lingered. I hadn't told her about the will, because I wanted to know whether she still saw me as someone she'd already buried, or someone worth knowing again. And after Thanksgiving, I wasn't sure which truth hurt more: that I'd waited 28 years for a moment like that, or that it came with so many strings knotted beneath the table. Morning arrived with the kind of hush that only comes after something unspoken has finally begun to stir. I woke to the sound of dishes clinking softly in the kitchen, the scent of coffee drifting up the stairs like a cautious invitation. I dressed slowly, folding the blanket at the foot of the bed out of habit, as if being neat could make me smaller, easier to keep. When I stepped into the hallway, Rachel was already there, at the stove, in slippers, the same way I used to see her when she was a teenager making boxed mac and cheese in the middle of the night. She didn't turn when I entered. "There's coffee," she said. Her voice was soft, almost strained. "And eggs if you want." I poured a cup and sat at the end of the island, watching her back. It had always been like this with us. Conversations through movements, apologies through action. We weren't built for declarations. We never had been. But something was shifting. I could feel it in the way she moved slower than usual, in how her shoulders didn't pull back into armor. She set down the spatula and turned. Her face was pale, tired in a way that no sleep could fix. "I didn't know how to invite you without sounding like a hypocrite," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "I didn't even think you'd come." I didn't answer. I let her keep going. "I was angry for so long," she said, wrapping her arms around herself like she needed the comfort of her own body. "I thought if I stayed angry, I'd stay in control. That cutting you out would protect me somehow. From disappointment, from hurt, from having to look at things I didn't want to face." Her voice cracked. She didn't try to hide it. "But I didn't tell them," she whispered. "The kids. I never told them about you. Not because I hated you, but because I didn't know how to explain it. How to say I walked away and just never looked back." I sat still, my hands cradling the mug as if warmth alone could keep me from shaking. "I didn't think about what it would do to you," she said. "I didn't care. Not then. But when I saw the article, when I realized you'd been out there, living your life without me, without any of us, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." She looked down, then back up. "Shame." The room held its breath. And in that moment, I realized something important. She hadn't invited me out of greed. Not really. She had invited me because the silence had become heavier than the grudge. I reached across the counter, not for a hug, not for a dramatic reconciliation, just a hand. And when she placed hers in mine, I didn't say I forgave her. I didn't have to. Some things don't need words, just presence, and the quiet decision to begin again. We sat there in the kitchen for a long time, hands resting between us on the counter, neither of us speaking. The house had stilled, the kind of stillness that comes not from absence, but from breath being held. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, the slow drip of a faucet that hadn't been tightened. Every sound felt louder now, like the silence had finally made space for it. I watched Rachel's fingers against mine. Older now, slimmer, her knuckles softer than I remembered. It hit me then, how many years I'd missed, not just of her life, but of who she'd become. She looked like me, and I wondered if she'd ever noticed it, in the mirror, before deciding to erase me. She pulled her hand back eventually and poured herself coffee. The tears had dried, but something remained in her face, open, raw, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, trying not to cry over a broken toy. I could feel it pressing at my chest, the secret I'd been carrying, the one I hadn't planned to share. But now, it felt like withholding it would be cruel. I sipped from my cup and spoke slowly. Daniel left everything to me, I said. The house, the estate, the land, all of it. Rachel looked up, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. I read that, the article. I know, I said, but I didn't just keep it. I made plans. I've already met with the attorney. It's being passed on. To who? She asked, though I could see the answer forming on her face before I said it. To your children, I replied. When they're older. When they can use it for something that matters. College, a home, starting over. Whatever they need. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her fingers curled around her mug. You didn't have to do that. I know, I said. I wanted to. She shook her head once, quietly. Why? It wasn't defensive or accusatory. It was small, honest. I looked at her for a long moment. Because I wanted them to know they were never forgotten, even if I never had the chance to know them. I wanted them to have a piece of where they came from, even if you never told them I existed. She looked away then, out the window, as if trying to find something familiar in the trees. They deserve a start, I added, one that isn't shaped by old wounds. Her shoulders fell. The quiet wrapped around us again. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. There were no gasps, no cries of gratitude, just the quiet shifting of something between us. An old pain exhaling, a wall beginning, just barely, to give way. I had kept the secret not out of pride, but protection. I didn't want to buy her love. I just wanted to leave behind something better than what we had made. She didn't thank me, not with words at least, and I didn't expect her to. Gratitude is a language that takes time to relearn when your vocabulary has been shaped by absence. But something in her changed after that morning. She moved slower, looked longer, paused before speaking. There was no grand apology, no sudden warmth, just small things. She offered to pack me leftovers, asked if I wanted another cup of tea before my drive. She touched my shoulder as I walked past her in the hallway. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter, a loosening, an unspoken admission that maybe the story she'd been telling herself all these years wasn't the only version that deserved to be told. I left the house just after noon. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame like she used to when waiting for friends to pick her up as a teenager. We didn't hug. We weren't ready for that. But we stood there for a moment, both of us trying to memorize each other differently this time, without the sharp edges, without the noise. "I'll tell them," she said, as I stepped down the porch. "The kids. About you. About everything." I nodded. "Start with the good parts." She almost smiled. Almost. As I drove away, I thought about the things I had given her, things she hadn't asked for, and maybe didn't even realize she'd been handed. A mother who showed up, even when she didn't want her to. A truth she couldn't keep ignoring. A future for her children, untouched by the weight of old resentments. I gave her presence, and silence, and then finally, space. But I also took something back. I took back the version of myself I'd abandoned years ago. The one who stopped writing letters because she was tired of never getting one in return. The woman who had learned to shrink to fit inside someone else's bitterness. The mother who had been treated like a shadow and had forgotten what it felt like to be real. I didn't leave her house lighter. That's not how healing works. But I left standing straighter, knowing I hadn't begged, I hadn't bargained, I hadn't twisted myself into something she could accept. I had come as I was. I had offered what I could. And then I had walked away without needing anything more. That was what I took back. The dignity I hadn't even realized I'd given up all those years ago, when I waited by the window, hoping she'd remember me without the lure of an inheritance. Some stories don't end in reconciliation. Some don't end at all. But this one, ours, was finally shifting. Not into what it could have been, but into what it honestly, painfully, quietly had become. I drove home through the back roads, avoiding the highway, letting the trees and the slow turns unwind something in me I hadn't realized was still knotted. The autumn leaves were thinning now, the last of them clinging to their branches like a goodbye held just a few seconds too long. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Some truths settle in you so completely, they leave no room for tears. What I felt was quieter than sadness, deeper than relief. It was a kind of knowing. I had walked into that house as a stranger. I had sat at her table like a guest. But I hadn't played the part she expected. I hadn't begged to be let back in, hadn't dangled my wealth or my regret like some desperate invitation. I'd simply come as I was, flawed, quiet, unafraid. I think that unnerved her. I think for the first time, she saw me not as the mother she'd run from, but as a woman she couldn't reduce to the past. Rachel had built her identity out of my absence. Her anger had given her structure, her silence a kind of safety. But sitting across from me, hearing the way I spoke, watching the way I didn't reach to fix what was broken, it forced her to see something uncomfortable. Not a villain, not a victim, but a reflection. The things she had hated in me were, in part, the pieces she didn't want to see in herself. That was what I'd become. Not her nurturer, not her enemy, but her mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They just stand there, quietly, offering back whatever is set before them. Maybe that's why she couldn't meet my eyes at dinner. Why she hesitated when her daughter asked who I was. Why she didn't argue when I told her I'd given the inheritance to her children instead of her. She was starting to see what had really been lost. Not money or time, but the cost of carrying a story too long without asking if it was still true. I don't know what happens next. I'm not waiting for Christmas cards or phone calls, or the sudden softening that people write about in stories where everything ties up neatly in the end. But I do believe something shifted. And shifts, no matter how small, create cracks. And cracks, when left alone long enough, let in light. Maybe one day she'll call. Maybe one day her children will visit. Maybe one day I'll sit across from her not as a ghost of who I used to be, but as a person she finally wants to know. But if that day doesn't come, I'll still have this. I showed up. I stayed whole. I told the truth without asking for anything in return. And when I walked away, I wasn't empty. I was finally seen. Even if just for a moment, I was no longer erased. I was remembered. Some stories don't need a dramatic ending. They just need an honest one. I didn't leave Rachel's house with a hug. I didn't leave with promises of visits or rekindled traditions. I left with something harder to hold, but somehow more valuable. A quiet truth that, for the first time in 28 years, she saw me not as the mother she left behind, but as a woman who survived being forgotten. I spent years believing that silence meant failure, that if a daughter no longer called you mom, it meant you had lost. But sometimes, the loss isn't yours. Sometimes, it's what they miss by pushing you away. She may never say it aloud. She may never call just to talk. But I know the mirror I left behind will keep showing her what she tried not to see. What love looks like after pain. What strength looks like without apology. And I am no longer waiting. I am living. And when my grandchildren are old enough to ask who I was, they won't hear my story from a stranger. They'll hear it in their own lives. Because I didn't come to reclaim the past. I came to leave something behind that mattered. Thanks for spending time with this story. If it resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone else may need to hear it too. Watch another real-life journey by clicking on the left and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.